Well, welcome back. Glad to see you again today. I thought today would do something a little different.
Today is a more feel-good style of painting video. A little bit of an admission, I've actually never painted any of Bob Ross's paintings before. I figure what better time than right now, right? So I picked a painting that he did from season 1. It's episode 5 and it's called A Quiet Stream. And it features a really warm green-yellow background with a waterfall, and it's framed on both sides by trees. And then to make things interesting, I actually painted the scene 3 times. So this video is me painting the scene both traditionally in oils, which you can see on the right, and then digitally in Photoshop on the left. And I wanted to use the techniques that Bob uses in his tutorial. So I tried really hard to wrestle those Photoshop brushes into looking like actual oil paints. So a couple of things that were immediately challenging for this project. If you've watched any of Bob Ross's videos, you know that he uses palette knives and, as he would call it, the almighty fan brush pretty extensively in all of his paintings. And here you go, second admission of the day. I don't own those. Not really. I do have a couple of palette knives which you can see, but they're really tapered and narrow, and they're just not made for applying paint in the same way that Bob's were. Mine are made for mixing paint, and that's about it. So you can see they actually take off more paint than they apply, it's not great. By comparison, the palette knife brush in Photoshop, it's not really a concern. Unfortunately, though, the brush that I chose to approach the trees in Photoshop just, it was so gooey and muddy, and I hated it. So I scrapped it. Anyone that tries to tell you that painting digitally is easier than traditional media, they're lying to you. But it did give me an opportunity to edit some things that I was already not really fond of. So I started by pulling the blue of the background up a little bit further, and I blended the light source a little bit more into it. And that just created a better foundation for what I wanted to do going forward. I was also able to change where the trees were. They were looking pretty static initially, so I was able to give them a little bit more movement and have a little bit better framing the second go around. So it's really interesting, and going back and looking at both sides of this, it's a lot more evident, but the scene really reminds me of an American landscape painter from the late 1800s, George Inness. He's one of my favorite painters, and I've had the pleasure of seeing some of his work at a few of the museums that I've been to. And he revolutionized a style of painting called tonalism, which is where a landscape would take on a lot more of an atmospheric, hazy look. So there'd be large pools of color, cloudy detail, there'd be lots of fog, and much less emphasis on hard details. I really got that vibe from the scene. It's really interesting for me to see in hindsight. And you can see some of that haziness, especially in the background right now, especially with how cloudy the light source is and how soft the edges of the trees are. It definitely comes across more on the Photoshop side, largely in part, I think, to the type of brush that I used, which actually ended up being really well suited to the technique that Bob uses to create leaves, which is kind of like this outward pushing motion. Photoshop brushes in general, they're, well, they're not perfect when it comes to replicating actual brush load and pressure sensitivity. They've been trying for years, and you know they're not bad, but they're still not perfect. So you don't really get the same initial hard edge that you would get with actual oil paints. So I finished laying in the details for the general like bush and tree shapes, and you can kind of see by comparison on the oil painting side where there's that almost like an impasto type of look on the leaf clusters themselves. One of the difficulties that I had, especially with the panel that I set up, is that Bob doesn't ever use an underpainting. He generally starts with a white base that's still a little wet and works the painting up from there. Or in the case of this particular scene, he starts with a tonal background. And my painting was actually one that I reused from an oil sketch that I started and I abandoned a while ago. So it already had a bunch of stuff going on, and I painted over it. So if I were to go back and redo this in oils, I think I would start from a blank slate in the same way that Bob does, because you can see later on when I finish everything up, there's actually quite a few spots where I really should have put more paint on it. It's a little patchy in areas. If memory serves right, the water and the waterfalls are the part of the video where Bob breaks out the fan brush. And if you remember, that's the second tool that I don't own. So on the oil painting, I end up using just a large flat brush, and you can see it actually ends up looking pretty okay. By comparison, unfortunately, the brush that I had chosen in the digital painting, it just didn't work out as well as I had hoped. The cool thing about working with oils is that you can take a lightly loaded brush and gently sweep over an area to get those nice translucent water effects. But there's just a lot of inherent blending that happens, and those just don't translate in a digital setting. So you can see that the brush that I chose to try and emulate the water is pretty heavy-handed. And when I end up painting this a third time, I actually end up approaching it as a slightly different way. But this is just one of those techniques that didn't translate very well. So at this point, I'm actually getting pretty close to finishing up the oil painting. As you can see, I've laid in a bit of the foreground, like the dead tree and the bushes surrounding it, which I have to admit, it was always the craziest part about Bob's videos. He would just go straight in with that dark silhouette right in the middle of his landscape, which was anxiety-inducing. But you know what? Actually doing it's not so bad. It actually does add something to the piece. So props to him for figuring that out and being able to just do it. So you see in the video how the oil painting is propped up against a wall with a window behind it. So that's because my studio gets pretty fumy. And unfortunately I was working on a blustery day, and I finished this up right about at the 15-minute mark, so it's coming up here pretty quick. I came back in several hours later, and the wind had blown the painting off my stand, and it landed face down with the palette face up beneath it. It was super great. So after peeling the wet palette off my finished painting, I had to go back and do quite a bit of rescue work. So that 50-minute mark or wherever, that's how the painting completed. But the finished image at the end of this video, that's post-renovation. From this point, I finished up the digital painting pretty quickly, and fortunately without further tragedy. One of the things that Bob always says in his videos is that if you have extra time, you are more than free to put more work into the painting. And you know what? I think we can all agree that he was an absolute wizard, putting as much detail as he always did with just a 30-minute show. But I did take some extra time and get a little carried away, putting in some extra trees in the foreground and bumping up some of the highlights in the details. But you know, I think it was worth it, and I'm actually pretty happy with how it turned out. And here you can see both finished pieces side by side. I hope you all enjoyed. Please keep a lookout for round 3, where I take the same scene and paint it in Photoshop using my own techniques. In the meantime, big shout out to my Patreon supporters. You can find links to my other social media as well as my Patreon in the comment section below, and I will see you next time. Thanks!